It always happens the same way. You're at your lowest, barely holding yourself together, hoping, maybe even expecting that someone will show up. Maybe it's the person who always claimed they'd be there no matter what. Maybe it's a friend who's shared your laughter but never really your tears. And then, in that vulnerable silence, when you finally reach out, you're met with nothing. No reply, no call, no presence, just the cold realization that you're alone. Again, you ask yourself, how can someone who said they care just disappear like that? It's a brutal kind of hurt. Not the loud, dramatic kind. It's the quiet ache of needing someone and realizing they've chosen to vanish. And the worst part? It's not the first time. Because if you look back, if you're honest, the signs were always there. The shallow check-ins, the vague reassurances, the disappearances that were always justified with excuses that didn't quite sit right. But you ignored them because you wanted to believe. You wanted to believe that when it really mattered, they'd be different. They weren't. Carl Jung once said that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But some people, instead of transforming, evaporate. They retreat the moment depth is required. When your soul speaks in pain, they only know how to respond with distance. And you're left asking the same question you've asked too many times. Why do they disappear just when I need them most? What is it about your pain that makes people run? But maybe the better question isn't about them. Maybe it's about you. Maybe it's about why you keep choosing people whose love folds in the face of truth. Maybe it's about understanding that presence is not something that can be promised with words. It's proven when everything falls apart. So the next time someone vanishes just when your world collapses, don't take it as a reflection of your worth. Take it as a revelation of theirs. Because the truth is, not everyone who stands beside you in the sunshine is willing to walk through your storms. And that's where the real story begins. Let's be honest, some of the people you call your support system wouldn't know how to hold space for you if their life depended on it. They smile, they hug, they say all the right things. But when the air gets heavy with truth, when you need more than small talk and surface-level affection, they shrink, they vanish, or worse, they stay but only in body. Their eyes glaze over, their words fall flat, and suddenly you feel lonelier sitting next to them than you ever did alone. That's the illusion. That's what we need to talk about. You see, not all who seem supportive truly are. Roles like friend, partner, or even family come with expectations, but not always with emotional maturity. Some people inherit these titles, but never grow into the capacity to hold them. They want the comfort of connection without the discomfort of responsibility. They want access to your light but flinch at your shadows. And yet, we keep handing them our trust because we confuse proximity with presence and attention with care. Carl Jung taught that what we fail to confront in ourselves, we unconsciously project onto others. Many people carry the label of supportive simply because they fear facing their own helplessness. They want to be near you when you shine, because it makes them feel alive. But your pain, your brokenness, that reflects back to them the very things they've spent their lives avoiding. So instead of staying, they label you too much, too emotional, too intense, and exit stage left. The hardest truth to swallow is that some people are only emotionally available when it costs them nothing. The moment you ask for presence that requires depth, you'll see just how shallow their support really is. And it's not your fault. It's not because you asked for too much. It's because they never had the capacity to give. So don't beat yourself up for expecting more. You weren't wrong to believe in them. You were just hoping they were someone they hadn't yet become, and maybe never will. Emotional maturity isn't about words, it's about energy. It's about consistency. And when that's missing, all you're left with is the shell of support, hollow and echoing with the sound of your own unmet needs. Carl Jung believed that within each of us exists a shadow, a collection of the parts we reject, suppress, or deny because somewhere along the way we were told they were unlovable. Anger, insecurity, fear, need, the very emotions that make us human. But instead of facing them, many of us push them into the dark, pretending they don't exist. And what happens when someone else's pain brings our shadow into the light? We flinch, we run, we disappear. That's the part most people don't understand. When someone vanishes in your moment of pain, it's not always because they don't care, it's because your vulnerability reflects back what they refuse to look at in themselves. Your grief reminds them of their own buried sadness. Your fear echoes a past they've tried to forget. Your brokenness whispers to their unhealed wounds. And suddenly, your need becomes unbearable no because of what it is, but because of what it awakens. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That includes how we handle others. A person who hasn't faced their own emotional depths will instinctively recoil from yours. They'll label it as too much, when really it's too familiar, too close, too revealing. So they disappear not from you, but from the parts of themselves you unknowingly exposed. That's the cruel paradox. The more honest you become, the more you risk being abandoned by those still hiding from their own truth. Your authenticity disrupts their denial. Your rawness breaks their emotional autopilot, and instead of stepping closer, they step away not because you're broken, but because you're real. And realness is terrifying when you've spent a lifetime wearing a mask. So the next time someone withdraws in the presence of your pain, understand this: it's not rejection, it's reflection. You held up a mirror and they weren't ready to see their own face. Your depth isn't the problem. Their unexamined shadow is. And maybe, just maybe, their disappearance wasn't a betrayal, it was a revelation. A painful, necessary sign that your healing can't depend on someone who's still at war with their own reflection. You think they left because they didn't care, that if they truly loved you, they would have stayed. But love alone isn't enough, not if someone lacks the emotional capacity to handle your truth. Not everyone disappears out of cruelty. Some vanish out of confusion, out of overwhelm, out of fear. What looks like rejection is often emotional incompetence in disguise. We tend to assume that distance means indifference, but more often, it means panic. Because when you open up, truly open up, you hand someone a part of yourself that requires more than kindness. It requires presence, stillness, strength, and those who have never built that inner structure don't know what to do with it. So they shut down, they ghost, they make excuses. They retreat behind busyness, sarcasm, or silence, hoping you'll stop needing what they're incapable of giving. Carl Jung understood that behavior is often the tip of something much deeper. He taught that defense mechanisms arise when the ego feels threatened, and avoidance, that's one of the strongest. It's not just a personality trait, it's emotional armor. For some, distance is the only way they've learned to stay safe, because closeness feels like exposure, and exposure feels like danger. So when you show them your softest, realest self, they interpret it as a trapeze if all you wanted was connection. This isn't to excuse the pain they caused. Their absence still hurts. But understanding it, that's how you free yourself. Because once you realize their vanishing act wasn't about your worth but their lack of tools, you stop internalizing the blame. You stop shrinking. You stop questioning whether you're too much. And you start recognizing that you were simply too real for someone still hiding behind emotional training wheels. Avoidance isn't love. Disconnection isn't care. And silence is not safety, it's a wound, speaking without words. So when someone pulls away just when your soul starts speaking, don't chase them. Don't beg them to return. Because what you need isn't someone who disappears under pressure. What you need is someone who knows how to stay. Someone who's learned that intimacy isn't something to fear, but something to rise toward. Anything less isn't support, it's delay. And you're not here to delay your healing for someone else's avoidance. Not anymore. There's a strange thing that happens when you open your heart, when you cry in front of someone, when you break in a way that can't be hidden. You think you're asking for help. What you don't realize is that, sometimes, your vulnerability is a trigger. Not because it's wrong, but because it reflects something the other person has never faced in themselves. Your pain, raw and visible, becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, they see their own wounds, the ones they've buried so deep they forgot they were still bleeding. Carl Jung taught that we project the parts of ourselves we can't accept onto others. So when you hurt, it doesn't just make them uncomfortable, it activates something unresolved. Your grief reminds them of the grief they never allowed. Your honesty cuts through the layers of denial they've wrapped around their own past. And suddenly, it's not about you anymore. It's about what you've awakened in them. They don't see your tears, they see their own. That's why some people recoil at your pain. It's not that they think you're weak, it's that they feel exposed. And exposure demands confrontation. But most people aren't ready for that. They don't want to look into the mirror. They don't want to acknowledge the broken pieces they've kept hidden under performance, perfection, or people-pleasing. So instead, they turn away from you, yes, but also from themselves. You bleed, and it unsettles them. Not because they don't care, but because caring would require them to face what they've been running from. And so they label you dramatic, sensitive, overwhelming. Not because you are, but because it's easier to name your truth than to meet it, easier to flee than to feel, easier to protect their illusion than to hold your reality. The next time someone pulls away when you're hurting, don't ask why they couldn't handle your pain. Ask what your pain revealed in them. Because sometimes, your suffering doesn't push people away, simply pulls their shadow to the surface. And they disappear, not because of who you are, but because they're not yet brave enough to face who they are when they're with you. We grow up with the quiet expectation that effort equals return, that if you show up, they will too, that if you love deeply, they will love you back. But life rarely plays by such neat equations. Emotional investment doesn't always guarantee emotional return, and the belief that it should, that's where heartbreak starts. Because we think love is a transaction, when in reality, it's often an awakening and not everyone wants to wake up. You can pour your heart into someone and still be left empty. Not because you didn't love well, but because some people only know how to receive in fragments. They don't know how to hold what's heavy. They don't know how to sit in silence when you can't find the words. They don't know how to stay when the energy isn't light. So they vanish, not out of spite, but out of incapacity. Some connections only work when everything's easy, when you're smiling, when you're not asking for anything real. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. That includes the parts of us that want to be loved back the same way we give. But love doesn't always echo. Some people love, in theory, not in practice. They're drawn to the way you make them feel, but they don't know how to return it. They take your emotional labor and leave you with silence when it's your turn to need. And still, you think it's your fault. As if you asked for too much, as if love is a scale you failed to balance. But the truth is, some relationships are built on light. They only survive in sunlight. The moment a cloud rolls in, they scatter like birds startled by thunder. That's not partnership. That's proximity mistaken for presence. Real love, real connection, it survives the shadow. It leans in when it's hard. And it doesn't require perfect weather to stay. So no, love isn't always reciprocal. Energy isn't always returned. But that doesn't mean you gave wrong. It means you gave real. And in a world that often thrives on superficial connection, that alone is sacred. Don't regret it. Just remember this. The depth of your giving reveals the limits of their receiving. And once you see that clearly, you'll stop waiting for echoes that were never coming. Some people will walk beside you, but only when the sun is shining, when you're smiling, when you're easy to love. They laugh with you, celebrate your highs, even call you their person. But the moment the clouds gather, the moment you need them to carry something real, they shift, grow quiet, back away. You think it's coincidence, timing, circumstance. It's not. It's conditional love, the kind that stays until it costs something. Conditional relationships operate on invisible contracts. You behave, you entertain. You don't ask for too much. In return, they give you presence. But the moment you break the terms by being messy, uncertain, heavy, the contract dissolves. Not because you did something wrong, but because their love was never rooted in connection. It was rooted in performance. And when you stop performing, they stop showing up. Carl Jung said, "The greatest tragedy of the family is the unlived lives of the parents. That unspoken pressure to be something you're not. It often begins in childhood. Smile. Be easy. Don't be a burden." We carry those lessons into adulthood, quietly believing we must earn love by being palatable. But true love doesn't require masks. It doesn't demand perfection. And it definitely doesn't come with terms and conditions. You'll notice it in how they disappear when your joy fades, how they become impatient when your healing takes longer than expected, how their words shift from warmth to withdrawal the moment you express need. Conditional love is never really about you. It's about their discomfort with intimacy. It's about their desire for connection without commitment, for closeness without depth. And here's the cost. You learn to dim yourself just to keep them close. You shrink your sadness. You hide your needs. You perform happiness while quietly breaking down. And in doing so, you betray yourself just to maintain a bond that was never truly safe to begin with. So if someone only loves you on your good days, they don't love you. They love the version of you that doesn't challenge their comfort. But the real you, the whole you, deserves more. Deserves someone who stays when you fall apart. Because love isn't a contract. It's a choice. And it should never be conditional on your ability to keep it light. Needing someone is terrifying not just for you, but for them. Especially if they've never learned how to show up for themselves. Your need becomes a spotlight, and in that light, their limitations are revealed. Suddenly, they're not just witnessing your pain, they're confronting their own inability to help. And that discomfort? It's often too much. So, they retreat. They disappear. Not because you asked for too much, but because your honesty exposed their emotional ceiling. There's a silent fear that lives in people who haven't done the inner work. It's the fear of not being enough, of being expected to hold something fragile and realizing their hands are too shaky. So, when you come to them with real need, you don't just ask for support, you ask them to meet a part of themselves they've never met. And some people would rather vanish than do that. Carl Jung believed that facing our inner discomfort is the path to wholeness. But most people aren't ready to face anything that shatters the illusion of control. Being needed requires presence. It asks someone to sit in uncertainty without fixing it. It demands stillness when everything inside them wants to run. And for the emotionally unequipped, that's unbearable. Not because they don't care, but because care, to them, means exposure. So what do? They create distance. They rationalize. They tell you, "You'll be okay," or "You're strong, you don't need anyone." But those words aren't comfort. They're exits. Carefully constructed exits that allow them to leave without looking like they did. Because being needed feels like pressure, and pressure exposes their lack of depth. But your need isn't wrong. Your desire to be held, seen, supported, it's human. And if it makes someone flinch, that's not your failure. That's their mirror. You simply held it up without knowing. And they weren't ready to look. So don't shrink your need just to protect someone's comfort. Don't apologize for requiring what connection is supposed to offer. The right people won't see your vulnerability as a threat. They'll see it as an invitation to step up, to grow, to stay. Because needing someone isn't the problem. The problem is when needing someone reveals they never knew how to be needed in the first place. It's one thing to be hurt by someone you barely know, but the sting cuts deeper when it comes from someone you trusted, someone who once said, "I'll always be here." The betrayal isn't loud. It doesn't always come with shouting or slamming doors. Sometimes it's quiet. It's the silence after your message goes unanswered. It's the hollow space where support was supposed to be. You realize they're not coming, not this time, and maybe not ever. What breaks you isn't just their absence. It's the collision between what you believed and what actually is. You expected presence, loyalty, maybe even love. Instead, you get distance, avoidance, excuses. And what's left behind isn't just pain, it's disorientation. Because you start to wonder, was I ever truly seen? Or did they only love the version of me that didn't need them? Carl Jung wrote extensively about individuation, the process of becoming your true self by separating from the illusions and attachments that once defined you. And here's the harsh truth. Sometimes that process begins with heartbreak, with the bitter recognition that the people you leaned on were never truly holding you. Their role in your life wasn't to complete you. It was to crack something open, to reveal the gap between illusion and reality so that you could step into your own. Their absence? It becomes the catalyst. The moment you realize no one is coming to save you is the moment you start saving yourself, not out of pride, not out of bitterness, but because you've been forced to see what's real. And what's real is this. Some people will fail you not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't meet you where you needed them. And that's painful. It's grief disguised as clarity, but it's also growth. So if you're mourning the ones who weren't there, don't confuse that pain with failure. It's transformation. It's your soul shedding its illusions. Because real individuation, the kind Jung spoke of, often begins in moments that feel like betrayal. But they're actually liberation, painful, necessary steps away from dependency and toward wholeness. You're not broken. You're breaking open. It doesn't make sense, does it? They're the ones who disappeared. They're the ones who let go when you needed them most. And yet, here you are, sitting with guilt, questioning whether you asked for too much, wondering if you should have said less, needed less, been easier. That's the cruel twist of emotional abandonment. It teaches you to blame yourself for someone else's absence. This guilt doesn't come from nowhere. It's old. It's ancient. It was wired into you when you first learned that love could be withdrawn. Maybe it started in childhood, the moments when expressing emotion led to silence, when needing comfort resulted in shame, when pleasing others became the only way to feel safe. You internalized the idea that love was conditional, that being low maintenance, agreeable, self-sufficient, made you worthy. And anything else, any real need, made you a burden. So now, as an adult, when someone lets you down, the script plays again. Maybe I pushed too hard. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe they'd still be here if I was better at handling things on my own. This inner dialogue doesn't serve truth, it serves survival. It keeps the peace externally while you silently unravel inside. Carl Jung taught that we must make the unconscious conscious. And this guilt, it's a signal, a clue. It reveals the parts of you still trying to earn love by disappearing into yourself. It shows the child within who still believes that being less of a problem is the only way to be loved. But here's what no one taught you back then. Your needs were never the problem. The problem was the people who couldn't meet them. You still feel guilty because guilt feels familiar. It feels safer than anger. It feels more manageable than grief. But guilt is not truth, it's a habit. And like all habits, it can be broken. You don't owe anyone your silence. You don't have to shrink to keep them close. Their leaving isn't proof you failed, it's proof they never had the emotional capacity to stay. So let go of the guilt, mourn the loss, but don't carry blame that was never yours to begin with. Your healing begins when you stop apologizing for having a heart that feels deeply, for needing what every human needs, to be held, heard, and chosen. That's not weakness. That's your humanity. And it deserves to be honored, not hidden. There's a silence that hurts, and then there's a silence that heals. At first, being left feels like a collapsy hollowing out. You look around and realize no one stayed. The ones who said always didn't. The ones who seemed solid cracked under pressure. You feel the ache of absence, like a house that echoes after all the furniture's gone. And for a while, that emptiness feels unbearable. But then something shifts, slowly, quietly, almost without warning. The loneliness stops feeling like a punishment and starts to feel like a kind of freedom. Carl Jung believed that solitude was not isolation, but the fertile ground where the psyche reclaims itself. Because when everyone disappears, something inside you finally starts to appear. No more pretending. No more adjusting your tone to be accepted. No more shrinking your needs to keep the peace. When you're alone, There's no one left to perform for just you and the raw truth of who you are. And that's when the healing begins. That's when you start to see who was really holding you and who you were holding up. You see that some relationships weren't partnerships, they were performances. You were the stability, you were the depth, you were the presence. And their love was only real when nothing was required of them. So being left, it's painful, but it's also clarifying. It reveals who was true and who was temporary, who loved you and who loved the version of you that didn't need anything. That kind of loneliness is sacred. It cuts away the illusions, it burns the false attachments, it leaves you with only what's real. And in that silence, you meet yourself again, not the edited version, but the whole, unfiltered soul. You realize you never needed the ones who couldn't stay. What you needed was to remember your own strength, your own company, your own worth. So, if you find yourself in that lonely space, don't rush to fill it. Don't call it failure. Let it be what it is, a clearing, a turning point. Because sometimes the loneliest path is the only one that leads back to truth. And in that truth, you don't just survive, you rise. Real support isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or dramatic declarations. It doesn't always have the right words, but you'll know it when you feel it when someone sits next to your pain and doesn't flinch. When they don't try to fix you, or silence you, or redirect the conversation to something more comfortable, they just stay, fully, quietly, completely. That's presence. And in a world full of people who vanish the moment you become real, it's the rarest thing. You don't need dozens of friends. You don't need constant reassurance. What you need, what we all need, is someone whose energy says, you don't have to carry this alone. Not someone who disappears when things get heavy. Not someone who panics at your tears. But someone who lets your truth breathe. Someone who can sit in the silence between words and still hear you. Because they're not listening with their ears, they're listening with their presence. Carl Jung wrote that, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. That's the difference. People who have faced themselves, who've sat in their own mess, cried their own hidden tears, and emerged without turning away, those are the ones who know how to stay. They don't flee your pain because they're not afraid of their own. They understand that real support isn't about solutions, it's about solidarity. It's about being there, not just when you shine, but when you break. The beauty of true presence is that it doesn't demand anything from you. You don't have to shrink or perform. You don't have to justify your sadness or hide your cracks. You can just be fully, unedited, and they remain. That kind of presence is healing in itself. It reminds you that love doesn't disappear when you're at your lowest. It deepens. So if you've ever felt unseen by the ones you needed most, let that teach you this. The right people don't run from your darkness, they sit beside it and light a candle. They show up not because it's easy, but because you matter. And once you've felt that, even once, you'll never again mistake attention for presence. You'll know the difference. And you'll stop settling for less. There's a pattern to emotional cowardice, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. They show up when things are light, when you're laughing, glowing, uncomplicated. They know how to talk about movies, about work, about anything that keeps emotions at a safe distance. But the moment you bleed, they panic. The moment you ask for depth, they vanish. And they always have a reason. They're busy, overwhelmed, not in the right headspace. But the truth is, they're not unavailable. They're afraid of being needed, afraid of being seen, afraid of having to give what they've never learned to access within themselves. These are the people who romanticize intimacy but run from reality. They say they value vulnerability, but when you show them yours, they recoil. And the most dangerous part? They're often charming, affectionate, attentive. Until you become real, until you ask for honesty, until life asks them to be more than just present, they must now be emotionally present. That's when they shrink. That's when they start pulling away in subtle ways. Calls become shorter, texts lose warmth, their eyes stop meeting yours, and you blame yourself again. Carl Jung warned us that the greatest harm comes from people who cannot confront themselves. Emotional cowards are exactly that. They operate from fear disguised as detachment. But if you don't recognize the pattern, you'll keep inviting them in. You'll keep mistaking their initial attention for depth. You'll ignore the early red flags because their absence only shows up when you need them most. But here's the shift. This isn't about hating them. This is about protecting yourself. Recognizing emotional cowardice early is an act of self-respect. It means you stop handing your heart to people who haven't earned the right to hold it. It means you listen to what their silence says more than what their words try to promise. It means you no longer let charm distract you from consistency. Don't chase the ones who retreat when it gets hard. Don't soften your truth to keep them comfortable. If someone can't sit in the storm with you, they don't deserve to walk with you in the sun. Love is not proven by proximity, it's proven by presence. And presence that disappears when challenged was never love. It was a performance. There comes a moment when you stop reaching out, not out of anger, not even out of sadness, but out of clarity. You finally see the pattern for what it is. You chasing, them retreating. You opening, them closing. You giving, them vanishing. And in that silence, you didn't choose, but were forced into. You make the most important decision of all. You choose yourself. It doesn't happen all at once. There's still a part of you that wants to explain, that wants closure, that wonders if they'll come back, if maybe this time will be different. But slowly, that part softens, because you start to realize something. Sacred presence isn't something you beg for. It's something that's matched. And if it isn't, it's not yours to hold. Carl Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, but becoming yourself means letting go of who you had to be to keep others close. The agreeable version, the low-maintenance one. The version who tolerated silence, who made excuses for emotional absences, who thought crumbs were a feast. That version kept the peace, but it also kept you small. Choosing yourself in the silence means you no longer see it as abandonment. You see it as a boundary, as a line between who stays and who fades when faced with your truth. It means you stop auditioning for love. You stop chasing texts, chasing validation, chasing anyone who disappears the moment you need something deeper than convenience. This isn't about being hard, it's about being honest. You can still love deeply, still care, still hope, but now you do it from a place of knowing that you're not meant to convince someone to stay. You're meant to live fully, and let the ones who can hold your truth rise to meet you. So in the quiet you choose, not out of bitterness, but out of self-recognition. And that moment when you decide your presence is enough, your need is valid, your wholeness is non-negotiable, that's when everything changes. That's when the healing deepens. That's when you stop chasing shadows and start standing in your own light. Because love isn't something you plead for, it's something you align with. Anything less is noise, and you're done listening. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That is the final lesson, awareness. Because everything you've lived through, every silence, every unanswered message, every relationship that collapsed under the weight of your truth, was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to wake you up, to show you what love isn't, to reveal what presence truly means, and most of all, to return you to yourself. You've spent so much time wondering why they changed, why they pulled away, why they disappeared when you needed them the most. But awareness shifts the question. It moves you from, "Why did they leave?" to "Why did I keep asking them to stay?" And that's where everything begins to change. Because once you see it clearly you understand that their absence wasn't about your worth but about their limitation. You stop taking it personally. You stop internalizing their fear, their avoidance, their inability to meet you. You stop hoping they'll return as someone new, because now you know presence isn't owed, it's earned. And real presence doesn't vanish under pressure. It stays, it listens, it leans in. This awareness doesn't make the past less painful, but it makes the future more intentional. You begin to build a life where you don't settle for almost, or maybe, or one day, when they're ready. You start choosing people who show up without being asked. People who hear your silence as clearly as your words. People who don't need you to shrink to feel safe. Awareness doesn't harden you, it clarifies you. It teaches you that boundaries are not walls, they're invitations to meet you in truth. It teaches you that self-respect isn't pride, it's alignment. And it teaches you that real love does not disappear. It deepens. So no, you no longer chase disappearing acts. You no longer confuse attention with care. You no longer wait in places where your soul isn't fed. Because now you know, those who leave when it matters most are not your people. And those who stay quietly, consistently, without needing you to be easy, are rare, sacred, worth everything. Jung's final gift is this. The moment you understand why they disappeared is the same moment you stop needing them to return. You stop expecting presence. You start honoring it. And that's when you finally become what you were searching for all along home. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.